All right, Council. Next up is Phase 1 Archaeological Assessment, Fort Edward Land's presentation. We have Mr. Jonathan Fowler on with us, I believe. Hey, Mr. Fowler, how are you?
Good evening. How are you doing?
Not too bad. We appreciate all you have done to this point for us, and we look forward to the presentation.
I thank you very much for the invitation. And I'll do my best to keep my comments fairly brief. I'm going to assume that you can see the title slide here now.
We sure
and
can.
That's great. Thank you. And so what we're going to be looking at here this evening for a few minutes is the results of the Phase 1 Archaeological Resource Impact Assessment for the properties on Fort Edward Street. My name is Jonathan Fowler. I operate Northeast Archaeological Research Incorporated for, well, over 20 years now. I've been doing this kind of work, providing heritage resource consulting services to public and private sector clients here and abroad. My day job is teaching at St. Mary's University. And I'm going to give you at the end maybe my coordinates there, because I'm aware that our time is short tonight and I wouldn't want to miss out any opportunity to answer questions. So I'll give you my email at the end. So without further,
we don't want to rush anything tonight, Jonathan. So don't feel rushed for time here, right?
Well, in that case, make yourselves comfortable.
In relation, come on.
Who's ordering the pizza? Okay, let's see what we can do. First off, I'd like to frame the discussion in the context of cultural resource management. So just like in most Western countries now, if you want to do construction activities, there's going to be some kind of environmental assessment. We want to make sure that we're safeguarding the integrity of the ecosystem, the natural systems that sustain us. Similarly, increasingly, there is a concern for cultural resource management. In other words, the integrity of the cultural resource, the heritage resource, in this case, the archaeological resource. And in this case, we're looking at a piece of legislation which governs our activity here. It's called the Special Places Protection Act in Nova Scotia. It's a Nova Scotia piece of legislation, provincial jurisdiction. Were we working in a federal park or a federal national historic site, we would be looking at a different regulatory process. But for now, any provincial crown land or any private land, including water, around Nova Scotia is these heritage resources are governed under this act. And the way the province manages impacts to archaeological heritage is through these instruments called archaeological resource impact assessments. Essentially, what happens is clients engage archaeologists to come in and take a look at a site and make some assessments. And it tends to be a phased approach that we see. Phase 1, which is what this project was a preliminary scan, a high-level evaluation of a property, in this case, 2 contiguous properties, in which the archaeologist examines the historical record. Most of the effort at this stage is research that is desk-based, so archival research, etc. Is there evidence of archaeology in the property? And second, what is the significance of the archaeology in the property? Because that's really an important question. Archaeology can be defined as archaeological materials, archaeological resources can be defined as anything made or modified by people. And I was just shoveling at the end of my driveway the other day, and there was a Pepsi can that somebody threw out, and it was there in the snow. That is an archaeological resource. It's an artifact, but it's of zero significance. So you can see that a big part of this is to consider the importance of whatever archaeology might be present. That's the Phase 1 scan. And the Phase 2 scan, if it happens, is more of a mitigation phase, where here you normally see some kind of field investigation or intervention. Sometimes archaeologists simply watch a construction project to make sure that nothing of great value is disturbed. Other times, when sites are identified and construction can't be avoided in this area, we excavate a site completely. And we call this preservation by record. In other words, we get in there and we do a proper job of recording it before the heavy equipment rolls in. So we've just taken a look at a phase 1 investigation of this property, and I'm going to present you the high-level results. By way of methodology, simply to outline, as you can imagine, we look at published histories, we speak to local heritage societies, people in the know. We also rely heavily on archival resources. And fortunately, in this case, Fort Edward, Windsor, is very well illuminated by historical evidence. So this could include archival documentary, text records. We're very fortunate to have a very rich collection of maps, particularly from the 18th century after the establishment of Fort Edward in 1750. And those in particular, we integrate into digital mapping systems called geographic information systems, in which we can layer different pieces of information from different time periods, old maps, air photos, sometimes even geophysical data, and things like this. And increasingly, we have access to aerial laser scanning, or sometimes called light detection and ranging data, or LiDAR. This is 2011 data of Fort Edward, showing you what the site looks like with the buildings and the vegetation removed, with the study area indicated in red. So we use all of these kinds of techniques and technologies in order to answer that question. Is there archaeology here? And then, of course, question 2, if it's here, is it significant? And in this case, we can say yes to both. The results. There are really 4 main findings, and I'll briefly outline them. Number 1, not as well known as it might be, Fort Edward was built upon the ruins of an Acadian parish church. And so we know this from the archival record. There's been a fair bit of confusion in the secondary literature about this. So, in the report, I provide links to the primary source evidence. This parish church was demolished in 1750, and in fact, it stands partly underneath the blockhouse at Fort Edward. Now, in 2014, we conducted some geophysical surveys on the fort grounds, in fact, in the parade, and we mapped the foundations with magnetic surveying equipment of the vanished soldiers' barracks and officers' quarters, showing that this material can be well preserved and mapped very clearly with this technique. And underneath the blockhouse and sticking out particularly to the west, we could see traces of what we think is the remains of this Acadian church. Now, in 1997, Parks Canada, in the photograph in the upper right, conducted excavations under the blockhouse, and some of you may remember this, and they found a very curious archaeological feature, a burned layer packed with burnt clay wall fill material, typical material that you see in Acadian architecture. And at the time, they weren't really sure what that was, but since then, it's become clear that that's exactly where the parish church stood. So the map beneath is an analog in this case. Unfortunately, we do not have good mapping of this church at a large scale. So this is the parent community of Port Royal in 1686, showing you the church there, Saint Jean Baptiste, the priest's house, gardens, it's a large monumental cross. We've got a cemetery off to one side. And I show you this because we need to bear this in mind. When we're talking about a church, we're talking about an ecclesiastical landscape. We're not talking simply about one building. There is a kind of hard to define zone of architectural activity, including a cemetery. And that really preoccupied me in this work. Could we make some assessment as to where the cemetery is for this church? And I think it's not within the study area. I think we've got evidence that it's downslope. But for now, the church, at least, is within about 30 meters of the top corner of the property here. So it's close enough to be of great interest to us, and potentially we have archaeology straying into the study area or the properties in question. Number 2, of course, Fort Edward. Fort Edward, we think of it today as the fort and the ramparts, but it's important to remember that the fort had extramural architectural activity. So there were buildings, there was a forge, there were stables, there's a very substantial officer's garden. Some of this material we can actually see from period maps strays into, once again, the study area, including a whole range of buildings here and what are labeled as soldiers' huts. Very often the soldiers in this period were not very thrilled with the barracks, so they were permitted, when on garrison duty, to go out and make their own little hut and scrounge around to get material if they wanted to and make dwellings out of it. And you often get these at military sites in the 18th century. So there's some of those mapped in our study area. This is also a deportation site, and during the 7 Years' War, Fort Edward was used as a prison for hundreds of Acadians, men, women, and children who lived here, perhaps within the fort, perhaps without the fort. And that also is a matter of concern for us. There was a garrison cemetery where soldiers who died while stationed at the fort were buried. Some civilians in Windsor were buried there, and I have reason to believe that it might be the original Acadian parish cemetery as well. Some of you may know that this cemetery was well known historically. In the 19th century, it was drawn many times. It was photographed, and photograph at lower left shows the cemetery as marked by great willow trees. This is a tradition we see famously at Grand Pre as well. The old French willows, so-called, is a common thread, sort of binding these sites together. Well, I think this is well out of the study area. Nevertheless, it's part of the broader archaeological landscape. And before leaving Fort Edward, I'll just mention the view planes. I was surprised to learn when reading Parks Canada's commemorative integrity statement for Fort Edward, they list actually the view planes off of Fort Edward as a level 1 cultural resource. In fact, even ranked higher than the blockhouse itself, because it underpins the sense of place that explains why the fort is there at that place in the landscape. So the view planes themselves constitute a heritage resource that we ought to bear in mind as we consider the heritage ecosystem of these properties. 3, there was an important trading post at the foot of, not quite the foot of the hill, but on the slopes of the hill beneath Fort Edward. And this, sometimes called a truck house, which is an 18th century term, which simply means like a trading post, established sometime around 1752. And with the aid of large-scale survey plans fished out of the archives, we are now able to say for the first time with confidence where this is located. It appears to be located outside the study area, but immediately adjacent just to the northwest at the top of Cobbett Street. That said, and this is the map showing the study area outlined in red, we do here as well have evidence of a building of unknown function associated with the truck house in the study area. So this is a watercolor of the truck house painted in 1753 by a member of the garrison, a fellow named John Hamilton. A lovely little painting. It's actually, I've seen the original, it's in Library and Archives Canada in a bomb-proof vault, an impressive facility. But there it is, the truck house. This is a very important site, not only in terms of the commercial history of the settlement and later the development of Windsor, but also because in 1760, this truck house became one of 6 trading posts licensed by the government of Nova Scotia to trade with the Mi'kmaq. And it's part of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship commitments that the British Crown made to the Mi'kmaq at that period. So that treaty chain, in fact, that was referenced at the beginning of this meeting, actually connects to the history of this site in a very significant way. And fourth and finally, and growing out of the history of this being a center of trade through the truck house, when Windsor was incorporated as a township in 1764, the government created a weekly fair and a biannual market fair on the very site in front of the truck house. And I suspect this is precisely why, because of the history of the fort and the truck house, making this a central place in that river valley. They created an agricultural fair. which exists to this very day. That agricultural fair, the Windsor Fair, was in fact designated an event of national historic significance in Canada in the 1930s because it's as many of you may know, it's the oldest of its kind in the country. And as we can see from the air photo, a 1929 air photo here, we have evidence of some of the infrastructure from the fair here, evident on the property, and from this 1930s and slightly modified in the 1940s large-scale map, we see evidence of the horse stalls and the livestock stalls and various other features of the fair right there on that property. So all of that is in play as well. Those are the four. So by way of conclusion, what I've done here with this map is I've simply aggregated that data to give you a sense of how those features plot geospatially, correcting for distortions in the cartography using the GIS method, overlaying and then drawing these new features. Interestingly enough, when the pool was constructed in the 1960s, it seems to have missed everything. You would have thought that the pool would be a source of great disruption to the archaeology, but it's almost as if it's been targeted to miss the archaeology that we can document in this initial sweep. We can document archaeological resources here. We can evaluate them, and given all the connections I've just outlined, we can assign to them a very high level of significance. In fact, it's remarkable to me how rich this site is and how multi-textured, multi-layered it is, and how it connects each of the major communities whose histories are kind of braided together on this place. It's got a Mi'kmaq dimension, it's got an Acadian dimension, it's got an Anglo-American dimension. It's furthermore part of what you might call a narrative network of sites, and Parks Canada's surveys of visitors to Fort Edward indicates this, that people visit Fort Edward and go on to visit these other sites that are actually part of the same narrative of events. And so I mention that to you in trying to, again, create a sense of that heritage ecosystem, that there is potentially, well, really great potential for further mobilization of these heritage resources. In sum, I conclude that whatever the future may bring for these properties, if there is to be ongoing construction activity, further investigation is needed, a phase 2 assessment, in order to better determine the preservation of these and potentially other undocumented archaeological features. Certainly the site has been modified, it's been terraced outside of the pool footprint. Still, however, that doesn't mean the archaeological materials have evaporated. There's every likelihood that there is going to be preserved, though sometimes disarticulated materials. We call them in secondary context here at the site. So with that, I will yield and make myself available to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fowler. Great presentation. I'll open up to the floor now, Council, for questions.